Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. This first episode of the 5th season of the Brewery is a Halloween special, so I'll be discussing a very scary and on-theme commander, Muldrotha the Gravetide. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to both down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Muldrotha is a 6/6 elemental avatar for 3 generic, 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue. During each of your turns, you may play up to 1 permanent card of each permanent type from your graveyard. This level of reanimation makes Muldrotha one of the most versatile commanders out there. However, since this is a Halloween special, I want to make a very scary Muldrotha build. And what instills more fear into commander players than control decks? So if you're emotionally prepared for the horrors that lie ahead and feel like you can watch without averting your gaze, know that you have been warned. The control aspect is very favorable thanks to Muldrotha being able to reanimate one of each permanent type from your graveyard. So we get an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, and planeswalker if we can cast them. With enough of a balance of each type, we can reanimate plenty of cards each turn. One artifact we're fine reanimating each turn is Mindslaver. If Mindslaver locks are too scary for you viewers, then turn away because this is where the boogeyman jump scare is. With enough mana, you're able to Mindslave the largest threat at the table or the opponent most likely to be a threat to us. We can force them to attack us with their hate bears so we can kill them in combat. Force them to waste their removal spells on their own things, etc. Just typical Mindslaver things. However, when down to the wire, when there's only one opponent left, there's not much they can do against the Mindslaver each turn. We can also lock out players thanks to our land destruction package. This is definitely not for the faint of heart, so for those with weak stomachs, now's your chance to turn away. Strip Mine, Wasteland, and Ghost Quarter ensure that we always trade lands 1 for 1 until opponents have no lands left. Ideally, you want to go after any player who was heavily ramping in order to not be too evil, or target utility lands first. However, the deck is also running Crucible of Worlds with Azusa Laspa Seeking. Although I'm going to go over the mana acceleration section of the deck further along in the video, with these 2 cards out, we can use all 3 land-destroying lands to evenly take out lands amongst all opponents. That way you can blow up a land per opponent per turn. Keep in mind that Wasteland can only be used on non-basic lands, and Ghost Quarter has opponents searching for a basic land afterwards. You're still here? Wow, you really do have the spine for this. Next up, how about Relentless Board Wipes? Nevinyrral's Disc and Pernicious Deed help wipe the board, albeit with certain limitations. The disc is every other turn because it enters the battlefield tapped, but it's still recurable with Muldrotha. Granted, Muldrotha also dies if it's on the field, but no worries, we can consistently get Muldrotha into our hand with Command Beacon and bypass commander attacks altogether. The great thing about Command Beacon is that once we do cast Muldrotha from our hand, we can then play it from our graveyard as our land per turn with Muldrotha's effect. Then we recast the Nevinyrral's Disc or Pernicious Deed to continue putting on the pressure. Or maybe you don't want to wipe the board. Maybe you can just overload a Cyclonic Rift instead, the most salt-inducing play in the entire format. Don't worry, as you'd expect, the deck also has plenty of ways to consistently get this back into our hand whenever we need it. If dealing against some control, we can even take advantage of that. Having Aura Thief die means that we take control of all enchantments on the battlefield. So if opponents are stacking, taxing, or being a nuisance with their own enchantment-based control effects, those effects now belong to us. The great thing about Aura Thief is reanimating it and then sacrificing again when other enchantments enter the battlefield. However, maybe global effects are too extreme in some cases where spot removal will do. In that case, Seal of Removal, Seal of Primordium, and Seal of Doom can get the job done. Each of these enchantments are cheap to cast and can self-sacrifice for free at instant speed. Seal of Removal is amazing tempo loss at just 1 blue mana. However, you can also use it to bounce Muldrotha in a pinch as well to protect her. Seal of Primordium is amazing at ensuring opponents have no mana rocks whatsoever, unless they're indestructible of course, or any key enchantment. Seal of Doom is only limited to non-black creatures, but that doesn't stop it from icing any other creature at instant speed once it's on the battlefield. We can also leave creature deaths at the hand of their own controllers thanks to Blade Crafter and Demon's Disciple. What's great about these effects is that they can also hit planeswalkers if that opponent has no creatures left, and vice versa. We can just sacrifice it to itself and then recast it with Muldrotha when opponents have only 1 creature on the battlefield. Once that happens, we can very easily lock the board out of creatures and planeswalkers. So far we've seen how to keep opponents' boards clear of lands, creatures, enchantments, planeswalkers, artifacts, and also the will to live. But what about other spells like instants and sorceries? Don't worry, the deck's evil doesn't stop here. Glenalendra Archmage not only has Persist, meaning that it can negate twice before it lands in the graveyard without returning, but when it does happen, we can simply reanimate it with Muldrotha afterwards and have 2 more negate effects for just 1 blue mana each time. Sylvan Safekeeper can null any targeted effect aimed at our creatures at instant speed for free by just sacrificing a land. As we've already seen, getting lands onto the battlefield from our graveyard is no problem for this deck, so we can protect key creatures for little to no effort. Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves can do the same, but they've had to be equipped to key creatures like Muldrotha or any other strong creature we have on the battlefield. We can also just counter spells the old-fashioned way, with Fierce Guardianship, Pack of Negation, Swan Song, and Mana Drain. If Mana Drain is something that isn't viable for you to get right now, Counterspell will do just fine. These spells are clutch at countering the biggest problem for us, either for free or almost free. As with Cyclonic Rift, we can recur these fairly easily, which is something we're going to see further in the video. Not only does the deck have this suite of counter magic to work with, but the deck's also running Glacial Chasm as a literal catch-all to anything that can deal us damage, whether it's burn or combat. It doesn't prevent effects that are worded as loss of life, but at the very least we can survive combat and burn. The cumulative upkeep might seem like a pain, but remember that we can just replay this with Muldrotha later. So if the cumulative upkeep gets too high, don't pay it that upkeep and then play Glacial Chasm from your graveyard as your land for that turn. If you want to be more epic with using Muldrotha to bypass cumulative upkeeps, look no further than Ritual of Subdual. If none of you have ever heard of this card before, I don't blame you. This is the hipsterest of B-movie monsters, so hopefully this brew can make more players aware of this busted control effect that's in green of all things. What exactly does this card do? It makes all lands generate colorless mana instead of the colored mana they would have produced. Now, I know what you're going to say. This also affects us too. Yes, but what you do is you recast it from your graveyard before you end your turn, so that it only locks out opponents from tapping their lands for colored mana. Then when your upkeep comes along, we don't pay the cumulative upkeep. Now our lands can tap for colored mana. Then we just recast it before passing our turn again. It's a softer lock than the 3 lands mentioned earlier, that's for sure. That was pretty scary, right? If you're still here after those horrors I just presented, then you're ready for how else we're going to take advantage of the reanimation aspect of the deck. Sakashima the Imposter and Spark Double are included as ways to double and even triple Muldrotha's effect if they're able to clone her. Due to how their clone abilities work, they can be on the battlefield together. This means that apart from lands, unless you have Azusa in play, you can play the same permanent type from your graveyard during your turn since you have the effect multiple times on the battlefield. As an added bonus, Sakashima has a self-bounce effect in case you need to save him in a pinch. However, commander decks shouldn't be so reliant on their commanders. This is why Having Ghoul Lich is included as another way to at least be able to cast creatures from the graveyard. As an added bonus, it can copy that creature's activated ability, which is great for mana dorks. Victimize is another great way to reanimate creatures. This spell is amazing because it's a 2-for-1, so you can sacrifice a creature you want to die, like Aura Thief or others, in order to get back 2 creatures you do want back. Bonus points for getting back Plaguecrafter and Demon's Disciple to make the table sacrifice 2 more creatures for just 3 mana. We can also recover anything with Eternal Witness. Since Muldrotha can't recast instants and sorceries from the graveyard, getting Eternal Witness onto the battlefield can get us any card, but more importantly, any instant or sorcery we need. Taking it a bit further, Rift Sweeper can get something into our graveyard that was exiled. Exiling things is the best strategy against graveyard decks, but at least Rift Sweeper can get it back into the graveyard so that Muldrotha can play it again from there. Speaking of which, Elixir of Immortality is a great way to protect our graveyard at instant speed. If anyone were to exile our entire graveyard away, activating the Elixir in response is a great instant speed way to at least send our graveyard to our library. We also gain 5 life as a bonus, which isn't bad. As for getting things into our graveyard to maximize reanimation, the deck's running a couple of self-mill effects. Mesmeric Orb is by far the best way to get things into our graveyard, and it's a total nightmare for any non-graveyard deck. So this can be just as, if not more scary, than some of the other cards I mentioned in the beginning of the video. In response to the end of the turn before ours, we can tap down everything we can in order to self-mill as much as possible during our untap step. Underrealm Lich self-mills every time we draw a card. However, it's even better than that. Every time we draw a card, we instead look at the top 3 cards of our library, choose which one of those go to our hand, and the other 2 go to the graveyard. Not only is this great on its own, but it synergizes amazingly well with the card draw effects in the deck, which we're going to see soon. Ashok Dream Render and Liliana Death's Majesty also self-mill us but have to be activating during one of the main phases of ours to do so. At least even if we mill ourselves with Ashok, it'll only exile opponents' libraries and not ours. Ashok also locks opponents out of searching through their libraries, so it makes Ghost Quarter the same as Strip Mine. Liliana gives us a 2/2 zombie token as a bonus. She can also be used to reanimate any creature from our graveyard, so she performs double duty for the deck. Her ultimate is also amazing in a pinch since she can wrath the board. And if any of them were to reach 0 loyalty, we can just recast them from the graveyard thanks to Muldrotha. Thanks to Gravebreaker Lamia and Final Parting, we get to choose what goes into our graveyard from our library. It should be noted that these can get any card into our graveyard and with Final Parting also put a card into our hand. Final Parting obviously being an amazing way to get a combo out very quickly. The Lamia is also amazing since it lets us pay less for spells we're casting from our graveyard, which goes a long way in explosive turns. Buried Alive and Jared's Order do more or less the same thing but are limited to creatures. Buried Alive is just crazy good here since it gets 3 creatures into our graveyard, while Jared's Orders is similar to Final Parting, except that both cards have to be creature cards. It's still not an issue since the deck has plenty of amazing creatures that we can take advantage of and exploit. Speaking of exploiting creatures, Sidisi Undead Vizier is ridiculously good in this deck. We can tutor for any card in our deck, but most important of all is we can exploit Sidisi to her own ability. That way we can recast her from the graveyard each turn. Sidisi is usually my go-to card when tutoring with Gravebreaker Lamia, since I can recast her for 4 mana with Muldrotha afterwards. In any case, Sidisi can also be used as the sacrifice outlet in a pinch. Either way, the deck has plenty of sacrifice outlets to get creatures into our graveyard to recur them later. Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar are a given since they're free, instant speed sacrifice outlets that can also give us mana. They're possibly the best sac outlets in the deck, followed by the third altar, Altar of Dementia. This altar simply provides too much value. With decks like these, filling our graveyard is almost as good as filling our hand. We can also use the altar reactively by milling opponents who tutor something to the top of their library. Greater Good is another free instant speed sacrifice outlet. While Altar of Dementia gets the cards in our graveyard, Greater Good gets them into our hand and then 3 in the graveyard. Either way, if we have more cards than maximum hand size, they're discarded during our cleanup phase anyways. Mirren the Moaning Well, High Market, and Phyrexian Tower round out the sacrifice outlets. These being on lands that own enter the battlefield tapped and generate mana are great since they're hard to deal with. With the exception of Mirren, these are also free to activate at instant speed. They just have to be untapped to be at the ready. Alright, so we've seen the control and we've seen the reanimation. So how do we win? Wiping the board and preventing our opponents from playing only works if they scoop in hatred and or frustration. However, that's not how we want to do things. We want to be scary and evil, but not outright monsters. While we're controlling the board, we can be consistently draining the entire table with Kokusho the Evening Star. Being able to consistently sacrifice it and reanimate it multiple times in a turn might spell imminent doom for our opponents in just a couple of turns. Either way, it's a 5/5 flyer, which is nothing to scoff at. Until we get our engines ready, we can already begin chipping away life from our opponents. However, if hitting an opponent with a 5/5 flyer isn't as impactful for you, how about consistently creating Marit Lage thanks to Thespian Stage and Dark Depths? Getting a 20/20 indestructible flyer thanks to this combo is amazing, especially if you're able to give it haste with either pair of boots mentioned earlier. Keep in mind that you can also clone Marit Lage with Sakashima and Spark Double since they can exist on the battlefield at once. The double enters with an additional +1/+1 counter, so it's even bigger. What's so great about this combo? You can always just replay the lands later with Muldrotha in case Marit Lage gets dealt with. Either way, keep in mind that if we're constantly clearing the board, we can just keep attacking with all of our creatures when opponents have no blockers. Earlier I mentioned getting cards into the graveyard to make the most out of Muldrotha. However, we can't just depend on Muldrotha, and it's important to get cards actually into our hand as well. Guardian Project and the Great Hench draws a card whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control. Since this is pretty much guaranteed to happen at least once a turn, we can passively draw a card. However, once we get some of the previously seen engines online, then we can draw into quite a lot of cards. As a bonus, the Hench taps for double green and 2 life, plus it also puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature that triggered it. River Kelpie and Secrets of the Dead have triggers that don't really care about types like the previous 2 do. Any permanent that entered the battlefield from the graveyard is enough for the Kelpie. Same with spells cast from the graveyard. Notice that with the way it's worded, it also triggers if opponents do the same, so pay attention to that too. The enchantment has us casting cards from the graveyard though, so playing lands or cheating in cards isn't enough. Fortunately, Muldrotha just allows us to cast, so we can still trigger it. With Muldrifter, we can just cast it for its evoke cost each turn if we're low on cards, since it's just 3 mana to draw 2 cards. We can also do the same with Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. Casting it from the graveyard for its casting cost instead of its escape cost will get us a card, 3 life, and the potential of dropping a land from our hand onto the battlefield. So while we can reuse this to draw cards and get ahead, Uro is still a 6/6 that can be used to beat down our opponents once we've got a lock on the game. So we can cast it for its escape cost and then use it to smack our opponents with him. Mystic Remora is a given in this deck. Similarly to how we can abuse the cumulative upkeep cost with Glacial Chasm and Ritual of Subdual, once the fish gets an upkeep of 2 generic or more, we can sacrifice it and then recast it for just 1 blue. We can set ourselves up to do this every other turn in order to not stop ourselves from casting an enchantment from our graveyard that we might need. Nissa Vital Force is completely busted in this deck. Her +1 not only untaps a land for us to reuse for mana, but it can also function as a 5/5 blocker for her in a pinch, or an attacker when we control the board. However, the very next turn you can ultimate her to get a busted emblem that draws us a card via landfall. If that weren't enough, you can recast her that same turn you ultimated her, +1 her, untap a land, and then get her emblem out the next turn. So this means you can essentially get this emblem every turn, and these emblems are cumulative. So if you have 3 out, you draw 3 cards from landfall. That's insanity. Last but not least is Defense of the Heart. While this isn't a draw effect, it's a recurable cheating effect. When facing against hordes or token decks, this will trigger quite often, cheating us any 2 creatures from our library directly onto our battlefield. We can then recast it next turn and do it all over again if one of our opponents still controls 3 or more creatures. This is just too broken here. Now, in order to pull all this off, the deck naturally needs to generate a ton of mana. Fortunately, we're in the best colors for that. We already saw that the deck contains Crucible of Worlds and Azusa Lost But Seeking, but it's also running my favorite 3 ramp spells, Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits, to get even more lands onto the battlefield. 3 Visits has finally been reprinted in Commander Legends. I'm a bit disappointed that it's at Uncommon, considering that Nature's Lore has always been reprinted at Common when its original printing was Uncommon. But 3 Visits was a Common that's functionally identical, but now an Uncommon. Anyway, in any case, it's not going to cost more than $100 to get after Commander Legends, so now everyone can run my favorite trifecta as well. Diversifying our mana sources, the deck has Birds of Paradise, Elves of Deep Shadow, Llanowar Elves, and Finhorn Elves, which was also significantly finally reprinted after so long in Commander Legends, this time respecting its common rarity. Elvish Mystic is missing because the deck doesn't need so many sources for green mana. Having these 4 dorks is enough to help with casting an early Muldrotha. Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, and Soul Ring also help in getting out an early Muldrotha. The deck isn't 100% dependent on Muldrotha, but we do want to try and begin our control as early as possible, and Muldrotha helps with that, especially when we start getting things into our graveyard. The very controversial Jeweled Lotus also helps with an early Muldrotha. In fact, once we cast Muldrotha, we can recast it from the graveyard if there's no other artifacts to reanimate. That way we already have it for if we ever needed to recast Muldrotha. I'm going to reserve my analysis for this card for when I release my set review with the Commander Legends episode of A Flight once the set is completely spoiled, but at least for Muldrotha, it's definitely a great card. But if this rock, along with the Crypt and the Vault, are not viable for you to get, don't worry, since budget substitutes will do just fine here. Expedition Map is also crazy good with Muldrotha. For just 3 mana each turn, you can tutor your library for any land card. Not only is this great for setting up Marit Lage, but you can also use it to get any of the 3 groundbreaking lands that help lock out an opponent by blowing up their lands. You can also use it to get the Sacrifice Outlet lands, or you can also use it to accelerate you by mana for tutoring for Ancient Tomb, Cabal Coffers, and Urborg Tune of Yawgmoth. Ancient Tomb not only helps out with an early Muldrotha, but also helps us cast a lot of spells. But that distinction goes to Urborg with the Coffers. Being able to tap down for a ton of black mana is clutch for recasting Kokusho as often as possible from our graveyard. Remember that we can do that with multiple copies of Muldrotha, but also with Havigul Lich. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all viable fetch lands except for Prismatic Vista, all 3 dual lands, all 3 shock lands, Zagoth Triumph, Command Tower, and 2 of each snow-covered basic land in case anyone's running anything that benefits us for it. The reason I'm not running Prismatic Vista or any other rainbow land is because the deck can replay any fetch land to fix for any colors, and those slots were better used for the Sacrifice Outlet lands, the Groundbreaking lands, the Marit Lage combo, and the Urborg Coffers combo. Again, as with all of my deck techs, you don't need the original dual lands for the deck to function. Any budget substitute will suffice. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Muldrotha the Gravetide. I did go pretty evil with this build, but it is Halloween, so unleashing some horrors upon the world is sort of expected. Especially this Halloween that's on a Saturday with a blue moon in 2020. If that ain't evil, I don't know what is. If you're interested in this deck list of this spooky brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. And the Demented Kirby, happy brewing and happy Halloween.